everyone, and thank you for joining us. Our next presenters are members of a large research group whose goal is to study the language of whales residing near the exotic island of Dominica. Their goal is to understand sperm whale communications by collecting and processing massive bioacoustics data of sperm whale, detecting their basic communication units and language-like higher level structures, and validating these models through interactive playback experiments. With us today are two members of the research group, Gero from Carleton University, who is also the founder of the Dominica Sperm Whale Project, and Michael Bronstein from Imperial College London and Twitter UK. Shane and Michael.
Hi, yes. Good afternoon, I guess, for you, but good morning from where I am. My name is Gero, and I'm the biology lead for Project CETI, as well as a scientist in residence at Carleton University and the founder of the Dominica Sperm Whale Project. And Michael and I are pleased to be here today to present to you about Project CETI, which is the Cetacean Translation Initiative. So for hundreds of years, as many of you know, humans have thought at great depth about what animals might be saying to each other, and fascinated by the idea of really understanding the communication of animals. Many species have complex lives, very nuanced behavior, and make a wide variety of communication signals when interacting. And yet, many have argued that their communication systems simply can't be comparable, whether quantitatively or qualitatively, to that of human languages. But, perhaps this contradiction rests on the fact that we've never really listened for long enough or in enough detail or without the right tools before us to really determine whether or not this holds up to scrutiny. And animal communication researchers like myself have conducted extensive studies on various species, from spiders to primates, and of course the whales and dolphins, showing that animal communication really is multidimensional, has diverse strategies and functions, hierarchical components, and encompasses a number of different modalities. But a comparatively long list of prerequisites for language, at least in humans, have been demonstrated in the whales and dolphins, the cetaceans, and they share a lot of social characteristics that are strikingly similar to our own. Sperm whales have been sperm whales for longer than humans have even walked upright, and they have a rich social life and a complex communication system to go with it. And so whales are really important when asking these questions about communications and how those systems mediate their social lives, particularly given the fact that their cognitive abilities and certainly their societies rival anything on land. The sperm whales are the largest of all the toothed whales. They have the world's largest brain, and they can be found anywhere in the world from pack ice at either pole. And they share many life traits that are similar to most long-lived mammals. So for over the last 16 years, I've been following the lives of sperm whales off the coast of Dominica through thousands of hours of observation now. It's the first time that we've come to know these leviathans really as individuals, as brothers and sisters, as moms and babysitters, and as families all living together in the same community or a neighborhood even. Our population estimate is quite small. It's less than 500 individuals, and that makes up 30 to 40 social units, of which half of those we know very well and have documented across years. Compared to other sites where whales have been studied, but particularly sperm whales, these units show a really high residency rate and resighting. So we're able to see the same animals over days and weeks and months, and of course through years. And that's a huge advantage when we're trying to study the details of their communication. We can study them as they age, as they become moms, or across behavioral contexts to give us a much deeper look. In truth, there's really no other population of sperm whales that's been this well characterized. So for most of the individuals, we know their reproductive history, their kin relationships, their habitat use, their place in their dynamic social network, and all of the behavioral idiosyncrasies of the individuals that we are studying. And that really enables us to ask much more deeper questions about sperm whales. So when a sperm whale dives, just to give you guys context about what we're trying to do here, they're making some of the deepest and longest dives on the planet. They can hold their breath for over an hour and make dives 3 times deeper than most submarines choose to go. Now, a female will spend about 80% of her life in the darkness of that deep ocean and only about 10 to 15 minutes of every hour at the surface where the sunlight touches and where she interacts with the rest of her family. So as a result, her world is really dominated by sound. Visual systems don't work very well in the deep ocean. And so just like bats, sperm whales have evolved a system called echolocation to see in the dark. Their unique nose houses the world's largest natural biosonar system, and it's allowed them to exploit the deep parts of the ocean and makes them a key part of the ecosystem there as well. But what makes these clicks is really by moving air around their heads. They create 2 different types of clicks, and we think they have 2 different functions. The first is echolocation clicks that they use to see with sound, both for navigation and hunting. And these are some of the most powerful sounds that any animal makes in the world. They can be made over 200 dB, and that can be heard well over 10 kilometers away. So most of the energy of echolocation travels through the head twice, and it creates these really clear broadband clicks about every second as they search for food. Now, when they're communicating with each other, they make a different type of clicks called coda clicks. And these are often exchanged in bouts between 2 or more whales when they're diving together or socializing at the surface. And they virtually never produce these codas when they're alone. These clicks have a more obvious multi-pulse structure. So on a millisecond level, you can really see the repetition of the sound bouncing around in their head. And that creates this sort of unique voice cue that allows us to recognize who the speaker is if the whales are different sizes and the families are small enough in number. And sperm whale families are matrilineal. It's grandmothers, mothers, and their daughters that'll live together for life, and who do not migrate. They stay in small home ranges in the Caribbean, and they communally raise and defend their family together. And families in the Caribbean are small. They're about 7 animals swimming around together, and they show preferences to other families. So if they're not alone, they spend time with a specific other family, and we call that a bond group. And each family really has their own way of doing things, and they live together in a multicultural community, which I'll explain in a second. But they seem to mediate all of this social behavior with distinct patterns of clicks that we call codas. And to date, we've categorized 2 different classes. There are regular codas, where the times between the clicks are similar, and there are irregular codas where the times between the clicks changes, like this 1 + 1 + 3 or the 4 + 1. Now, in the first few hundred meters, when these animals dive, they make sort of duet-like sequences before they start echolocating and before they start searching for food. And these conversations often include overlapping calls and matching the exact same call type. So there's this elegant complexity, even though there's this apparent simplicity in the beginning of it just being clicks. But more often than not, these exchanges can be hours long, where they make thousands of codas as a family of 7. I'm hoping that I can play you an exchange from the whales. So this is an exchange of codas between 2 well-known whales called the group of 7, and it gives you an idea of the complexity and the ear for the different coda types that these animals use. Our previous research has shown that they use these a lot as a nested system for identity labeling. So there's one type of call that allows us to recognize individuals, and they use it particularly when they're starting their hunting dives. Another set of 4 click codas allows us to recognize the individual family units. And then there's these characteristic identity codas that seem to mark what we call clans, which are these socially segregated cultural groups. Because it turns out that families that speak the same dialect will spend time together, and families that speak different dialects will not. And so here you have a subset of of the social network of the whales that live in the Eastern Caribbean, and all the families circled in green make this 1+1+3 coda that's unique to the Caribbean. And the two families, at least in this plot, but there are 14 of them in the wild, are from a different clan. They never make that characteristic 1+1+3 coda and make a different coda instead. Their families are bigger. They move around with different patterns of habitat use and movement. And really, these make up completely different cultural groups. Importantly, these are just two of the characteristic codas. They make at least 24 different types, and they concatenate them back and forth in sequences like you've heard. So it seems simple at first that it's sort of binary, that there's either a click or a pause, but actually there's a lot more complexity that we haven't even started to look at. Oh. So while there's multiple efforts over the past decades to analyze non-human communication, there has been significant steps forward, but we still ultimately lack any kind of functional understanding of any non-human communication system. And in retrospect, that's really, our new understanding has been driven by two different ways of approaching it, either spending a huge amount of time with a small subset of the species, or there's been rapid growth at the moments of technological innovation. And that's certainly been true with computer tags that we've put out on the sperm whales over the last decade. That's given us a huge amount of data and far more than we're able to annotate. And that's one of the reasons why we're launching Sperm Whale Project CETI. So while the DSWP has really laid the foundation for the work we're going to do, if we're going to make big steps in understanding this, we need to record in an unprecedented way. And that's going to need to bring a team together of machine learners, roboticists, natural language processing, and biologists. And that is Project CETI. And Michael will introduce the project specifically.
Thank you, Shane. So pleasure to be here. So I'm Michael Bronstein. I'm professor of machine learning and pattern recognition at Imperial College. And I should admit, this is my first time in a conference on animals. So I'm a computer scientist. So you may wonder why at all I'm talking here. And maybe as Shane mentioned already, we believe that it is machine learning that brings this new exciting capability and possibly even a paradigm shift in the study of animal communication. And it is likely to become a cornerstone of future methods for collecting, processing, and analyzing multimodal streams of data. And in the past decade, or maybe slightly more, we've seen really a revolutionary rise of these methods, in particular a method called deep learning. And the impact of deep learning, in particular on human language analysis, has been short of dramatic, really. It has transformed and created entire industries. And in particular, it has made possible, probably for the first time ever, to perform automatically different tasks, such as automatically and accurately recovering different aspects of syntax and semantics, such as sentence structure and even grounded word meaning, automatically from large data collections. Next slide, Shane, please. Yeah, so maybe a little bit of history. If we look in retrospective on the evolution of human language analysis by computers, a field that is typically called natural language processing, or NLP, we can see that early approaches relied heavily on some prior assumptions about the language, typically in the form of handcrafted rules or grammatical structures. And this limited the scope of application of NLP to known languages and required a lot of human-guided processing and annotation. And obviously, it precluded applications in settings where we have no idea what the language is, like in our case. And what's happened in the field more recently is a shift from handcrafted rules. Yeah, if you can advance, please. And one more. From handcrafted rules to statistical and machine learning models that can actually extract the structure and rules from examples of text. And in particular, in the past decade, the emergence of deep learning techniques created a true paradigm shift in the performance of NLP methods. And deep learning is just a collective name for what previously was known artificial neural networks that are trained using backpropagation techniques on massive collections of data. And these methods exist for quite a long time. It was really the confluence of the compute power and the availability of large-scale data that allow to train very complex systems of this kind. And it was successful not only in NLP, it was extremely successful in computer vision, speech recognition, and it is nowadays technology that powers practically everything from the Siri on your iPhone to the autonomous driving on your Tesla car. Next, please. So just to give you an idea of how it works, in NLP applications, it's typical to see architectures that are called encoder and decoder. So an encoder is a neural network that operates on a sentence represented as a sequence of tokens, which roughly correspond to words, and it produces a multidimensional vector representation of each word that is known as word embedding. And embeddings are a kind of intermediate representation, or you can think of it as an imaginary language that has the structure of the original input. And then next, please. A decoder is another neural network that is applied to the embedding and produces the desired output from these embeddings. And this decoder is task specific. For example, if the task is to translate, let's say, from English input into Italian, the decoder will convert the input embeddings into corresponding sequence of Italian words. Next. And if we want, for example, now to translate from English to Russian, then we'll use a different decoder. And if the task is different, for example, if you want to detect spam, next, then it will use another particular decoder. So the main drawback of this architecture is that it's supervised. And what I mean by this is that it relies on some known pairs or couplings of inputs and outputs. And in our example of English to Italian translation, we had to rely on known correspondence of words. So it's a kind of Rosetta Stone, next please, that was famously known used by Champollion to decipher Egyptian language. And if we wonder where do such Rosetta Stones come in modern times, basically these are what is called Parallelcorpora in linguistics. And it's interesting, actually, NLP is probably one of the few cases where bureaucracy helped to progress research rather than hindering it. And one of very famous Parallelcorpus comes from the European Parliament, where important documents are translated into the official languages of the European Union. And this way you get these correspondence between different languages. But it's still basically this reliance on labeled data that requires humans or maybe some organization to annotate it is a big bottleneck. Sometimes it's extremely costly to produce, sometimes it's even impossible. And the recent years breakthrough in NLP especially really came from the realization that the embeddings can be pre-trained in a self-supervised way, where there is no human labeling whatsoever. So the data itself is used to guide the training. Next slide, please. So the typical way it works is you are given a sentence, you mask out some words and make the neural network try to predict the missing one from context. So it's kind of fill in the blank exercises that we often do at school. And learning this to do this task requires actually to discover automatically the structure of the language, at least to some extent. And neural networks appear to be capable of doing it if they are provided with a large corpus of examples. And it appears that this pre-training actually produces embeddings that are useful for many downstream tasks, and we can still apply a decoder to these embeddings that does something specific. Next, please. And here what I would like to show is that basically this was a recent breakthrough from Facebook done in, I think, in 2018. This is completely unsupervised translation. So the way that they did it, they did two separate encodings of two different languages. And then, next please, basically they were aligned geometrically. And apparently even different languages have similar structure because they represent more or less shared knowledge and shared world. So this way you can establish correspondence from the embeddings themselves without requiring any supervision. Next, please. So what is the crucial element of these methods is the training data. And it appears that the amount of data that is used to train these deep neural networks used in NLP is really dramatic. So just to give you a flavor of this BERT, which was 2018 model, it used data from English Wikipedia, relied on about 2.5 billion tokens, or roughly words. GPT-2 was developed by OpenAI, used 10 billion words. And then the classical already model from last year, GPT-3, used really a colossal data set of about 500 billion words. And I should say that this is probably the largest and more complex network that has ever been trained. So it has almost 200 billion parameters as well. That was already old news. It was dwarfed by a work from Google that has more than 1 trillion parameters. And I think a couple of days ago, there was an announcement from a group in China that have almost 2 trillion parameters. So it never stops. So if we want to apply this technology to whale bioacoustic data, we need to understand where do we stand in terms of the database that we can at least hope to collect. And in Dominica, yeah, Shane, I guess you can progress the slide here. As Shane explained, we observe between 50 to 400 whales, and looking at the way that they vocalize, and roughly probably 25% are communication clicks used as part of Codas, and looking at the typical Coda structure, we are talking about probably between hundreds of millions to a few billion clicks per year that can be collected. So it is obviously a rough estimate. Next, please. But basically it brings us to a data set sizes that are comparable to those used in NLP. Next, please. So it would obviously be probably too naive to think that only it's a matter just of size of the data set. So we're relying on many other things here, and we are really looking at an interdisciplinary approach to try to understand and interpret spatial whale communication that integrates robotics, biology, machine learning, and linguistics expertise. And the way that we try to approach is by, first of all, recording a large-scale longitudinal multimodal data set that captures communicational and behavioral data from a variety of sensors, then process it to creating a reconciled data set that you can think of roughly as a social network of whales. Then build machine learning models that try to model whale communication, and in particular, we can try to detect the basic units, whether it's acoustic units, something that corresponds roughly to phonemes in human languages, then the way that they compose, so basically some grammatical rules or morphology, and then try to ground them in some behavioral data, so basically to understand the meanings or semantics. And the way that we plan to do it is by basically creating a kind of a chatbot that interacts with the whales and talks back to them. So unlike the typical playback experience where these are pre-recorded messages, we would like to play back something that the whales that understands the whales, or at least try to predict what they try to say. So I guess am I out of time approximately? So I think I will stop here probably. Yeah, we can show some more pictures when we answer questions. So maybe a last comment from me. I think this is really a big moonshot project. It's a large interdisciplinary collaboration with a lot of people involved with different expertise, as I mentioned. And I think it is very cool, and we hope to show some interesting results in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael and Shane. And we do have some 6 minutes for questions. So I see in the chat box one question, a question for Shane. Do you think that these whales are naming each other using their vocalizations? And thank you for a fascinating presentation.
Well, thank you.
Dollings.
Thanks, Francine. Good question. So there's two things. One is we work under the hypothesis that they have the ability to socially recognize each other at different levels. Otherwise, it would be really hard to see the behavioral patterns that we see. If we all had identical names and looked identically, it would be hard to show, friendships and preferred partners just as a baseline assumption. whether or not they're using the same vocal cues that we're using to recognize individuals or that we use to delineate the clans is a big question. And it's something that we've started doing for the last couple of years now, using a traditional playback approach where we're playing clan-specific codas to known whales, using the voice of animals they know or don't know, and looking for changes in their behavioral response. And to date, it's kind of had mixed success. So we've had scenarios where, the animals ignore what we say, but we've also had some very interesting ones where animals respond to their own clan specific call with their family specific call. So I think part of it has to do with, as Michael was insinuating, rather than just playing back single pre-recorded calls where the sort of behavioral context of that happening is odd, and playing back sequences that make more sense from the animal's perspective. It's also quite clear that they're hyper aware that it's coming from the boat. The amount of boat investigation that we got after playing Codas was significantly higher. And so one of the things that CETI will be doing is doing so remotely through drifters and not from the boat itself. I think they see through the initial ruse of the traditional approach.
Thank you, Shane. And we have two more questions. One is Benjamin of Bells. Is it possible to distinguish between voices emitted by mature female whales and mature male ones, or calves?
Yeah. So yes, in two different ways. The simple one is that the size of their head dictates the structure in their click. So while any given click kind of sounds like a hand clapping, at the millisecond level, it has these multiple pulses as the sound bounces around in their nasal cavity in their head. So you can literally measure a whale based on the sounds that they make. And so the males are, up to a third larger. So the males stick out quite clearly, and so do the calves. The challenge becomes between two females that are, close in size, although we can measure them quite accurately. And that part, we've started exploring literal voice cues like changes in frequency centroid and in the same way that you and I would think about distinguishing voices in humans as opposed to whales. And that's had some preliminary success, but I think the work that we'll do in CETI will demonstrate whether or not that's possible in a more powerful way.
Thank you. There's another intriguing question about your research changing your reading of Moby Dick. Does it change?
And my reading of Moby Dick? Oh, I didn't see that one. Yeah, well, everyone asks whether or not you should read Moby Dick, and the short answer is yes, but I would encourage the abridged version. I think the science has changed quite a bit. Although I'm told that if you go to the Harvard Library, you can get Herman Melville's original copy of the Essex story with all of his handwritten sort of notes that in the margins that led to Moby Dick being written. So you can get his literal perspective of what he thought before writing it, which is pretty fascinating.
Great. Okay, so maybe we'll read the last question. Are you able to involve or collaborate with local human residents in this research? By Jane Desmond.
Hi, Jane. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over the last 16 years, the Sperm Whale Project has focused heavily on local involvement. I mean, I would consider the project a partnership with the local government and the fisheries division in particular, and that's even more so true now under CETI. So parallel to the research project, the Sperm Whale Project had been running a capacity building and education program, and now under CETI, that's going to be developed quite significantly. If we're going to have successful conservation action to protect the animals that we work with, it has to be driven by local leaders, and they need the capacity both financially and in terms of skill set to do so, and that's something that's been really important from our perspective. And if you contact me, I'd be happy to tell you more about that.
So great. So unfortunately, we're running out of time and need to move to the next session. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. I'm writing my email address in the chat box for anyone who would like to continue the discussion or ask a question, and I will pass it on to your comments and questions to the participants. So thanks again, Shane and Michael, for a fascinating presentation. Please
Thank
stay
you.
with
And
us for the, sorry.
I was just going to say that we have a paper out on arXiv. If people are interested in more detail, they can just Google it.
Oh, great. So please stay with us for the next session of this evening, Communications with Non-Human Animals, which will start immediately.